Chapter 7, How the Adventure Ended. Look at what? Said Edmund. Look at the device on the gold, said Caspian. A little hammer with a diamond above it like a star, said Trinian. Why, I've seen that before. Seen it, said Caspian. Why, of course you have. It's the sign of a great Narnian house. This is the Lord Octasen's arm ring. Villain, said Reepicheep to the dragon, have you devoured a Narnian lord? But the dragon shook his head violently. Or perhaps, said Lucy, this is the Lord Octarian turned into a dragon under an enchantment, you know? I needn't be either, said Edmund. All dragons collect gold, but I think it's a safe guess that Octasinian got no further than this island. Are you the Lord Octasinian? Asked Lucy to the dragon, and then, when it sadly shook its head, are you someone enchanted? Someone human, I mean? It nodded violently. And then someone said, people disputed it afterwards, whether it was Lucy or Edmund said it first, you're not Eustace by any chance? And Eustace nodded his terrible dragon head and thumped his tail at the sea, and everyone stepped back. Some of the sailors with ejaculations that I will not put down in writing, they mean things they said, to avoid the enormous and boiling tears which flowed from his eyes. Lucy tried hard to console him and even screwed up her courage and to kiss his scaly face, and nearly everyone said, hard luck, and several assured Eustace that they would all stand by him, and many said they were sure some way to disenchant him, and they'd have him all right as rain in a day or two. And of course, they were all very anxious to hear his story, but he couldn't speak. More than once, in all the days that followed, he attempted to write it for them on the sand, but this never succeeded. In the first place, Eustace, never having read the right books, had no idea how to tell a story straight. And for another thing, the muscles and nerves of the dragon's claws that he had to use had never learned to write and were not built for writing anyway. As a result, he never got nearly to the end before the tide came in and washed it all away, and all the writing, except the bits he had already trodden on accidentally, swished out with his tail and those things. And all that anyone had seen would be something like this. And the dots are for the little bits he smudged out. I went to sleep, Rogus Argons, Dragons cave, cause it was dead and aining so hard. Woke up and cool, get off me arm, to bother. It was, however, clear to everyone that Eustace's character had been rather improved by becoming a dragon. He was anxious to help. He flew all over the island to find things. It was all mountainous and inhabited only by wild goats and droves of wild swine. Of these, he brought back many carcasses and provisions for the ship. He was a very humane killer, too, for he could dispatch a beast with one blow of his tail so that it didn't know, and presumably still doesn't know, it had been killed. He ate a few himself, of course, but always alone, for now that he was a dragon, he liked his food raw, but he could never bear to let others see him at his messy meals. And one day, flying slowly and wearily, but in great triumph, he bore back to the camp a great tall pine tree, which he had torn up by its roots in a distant valley, which could be made into a capital mast. And in the evening, if it turned chilly, as it sometimes did after the heavy rains, he was a comfort to everyone, for the whole party would come and sit with their backs against his hot sides and get well warmed and dried, and one puff of his fiery breath would light the most obstinate fire. Sometimes he would take a select party for a fly on his back so that they could see the wheeling below them, the green slopes, the rocky hedges, the rocky heights, the narrow pit-like valleys, and far out over the sea, to the eastward, so a spot of darker blue on the blue horizon, which might be land. The pleasure, quite new to him, of being liked, and still more of liking other people, was what kept Eustace from despair, for it was very dreary being a dragon. He shuddered whenever he caught sight of his own reflection, and he flew over the mountain lake. He hated that huge butt-like wings and saw-edge ridge on his back, and the cruel curved claws. He was almost afraid to be alone with himself, and yet he was ashamed to be with others. On the evenings, when he was not being used as a hot water bottle, he would slink away from the camp and lie curled like a snake between the wood and the water. On such occasions, greatly to his surprise, Reepicheep was his most constant comforter. The noble mouse would creep away from the merry circle of the camp and sit down by the dragon's back, well into the windward, to be out of the way of the smoky breath. There he would explain that what had happened to Eustace was a striking illustration of a turn of the fortune's wheel, and that if he had Eustace as his own house in Narnia, it was really not a house, and the dragon's head, let alone his body, would not have fitted in, that he could show him more than 100 examples of emperors, kings, dukes, knights, poets, lovers, astronomers, philosophers, and magicians who had fallen from prosperity into the most depressing circumstances, and of many of whom had recovered and lived happily ever afterward. It did not, perhaps, seem so comforting at the time, but it was kindly meant, and Eustace never forgot it. But of course, what hung over everyone like a cloud was the problem of what to do with that dragon when they were all ready to sail. They tried not to talk of it when he was there, but he couldn't help overhearing them. Things like, would he fit along one side of the deck? And we'd have to shift all the stores and to the other side below so as to the balance, or would towing him being any good? Or would he be able to keep up if he was flying? And most of all, but how are we to feed him? And poor Eustace realized more and more that since the first day he came on board, he had been an unmitigated nuisance, and that he was now a greater nuisance still. And add this into the mind, and just as that bracelet ate into him feeling, he knew that it was only made worse to tear at it with his great teeth, but he couldn't help tearing now and then, especially hot nights. About 6 days after they had landed on Dragon Island, Edmund happened to wake up very early one morning. It was just getting gray so that you could see the tree trunks if they were between you and the bay, but not on the other direction. As he woke, he thought he heard something moving, so he raised himself on one elbow and looked about him. And presently he thought he saw a dark figure moving up on the seaward side of the wood. The idea that at once occurred to his mind was, are you so sure there are no natives on this island at all? Then he thought it was Caspian. It was about 8 size, but he knew that Caspian had been sleeping next to him and could see that he hadn't moved. Edmund made sure that his sword was in place and then rose to investigate. He came down softly to the edge of the wood, and the dark figure was still there. He saw now that it was too small for Caspian and too big for Lucy. It did not run away. Edmund drew his sword and was about to challenge the stranger when the stranger said in a low voice, "Is that you, Edmund?" "Yes. Who are you?" said he. "Don't you know me?" said the other. "It's me, Eustace." "By Jove," said Edmund, "so it is, my dear chap." "Hush," said Eustace, and lurched as if he were going to fall. "Hello," said Edmund, steadying him. "What's up? Are you ill?" Eustace was silent for as long as Edmund thought he was fainting, but at last he said, "It's been ghastly. You don't know, but it's all right now. Could we go and talk somewhere? I didn't want to meet the others just yet." "Yes, rather, anywhere you'd like," said Edmund. "We can go and sit on the rocks over there. I say, I am glad to see you, looking yourself again. You must have had a pretty beastly time." They went to the rocks and sat down, looking out across the sky and the blue bay, while the sky got paler and paler, and the stars disappeared, except for one very bright one low down and near the horizon. "I won't tell you how I became a dragon till I can tell the others and get it all out and over," said Eustace. "By the way, I didn't even know it was a dragon until I heard you all use the word when I turned up the other morning. I want to tell you how I stopped being one." "Fire ahead," said Edmund. "Well, last night I was more miserable than ever, and that beastly arm ring was hurting like anything." "Is that all right now?" Eustace laughed, a different laugh from any Edmund had ever heard him give before, and slipped the bracelet easily off his arm. "There it is," he said, "and anyone who likes can have it as far as I'm concerned. Well, as I was saying, I was lying awake and wondering what on earth could become of me. And then, but mind you, it may not have been all a dream. I don't know." "Go on," said Edmund, with considerable patience. "Well, anyway, I looked up and saw the very last thing I expected. A huge lion came slowly toward me. And one queer thing was that there was no moon last night, but there was a moonlight where the lion was. So it came nearer and nearer, and I was terribly afraid of it. You may think that being a dragon, but I would have knocked any lion out easily enough, but it wasn't that kind of lion. I wasn't afraid of it eating me. I was just afraid of it, if you can understand. Well, it came close up to me, and looked straight into my eyes, and I shut my eyes really tight, but it wasn't any good because it told me to follow it." "You mean it spoke?" "I don't know. Now that you mention it, I don't think it did, but it told me all the same, and I knew I'd have to do what it told me. So I got up and I followed it, and it led me a long way into the mountains. And there was always this moonlight over it, and and around the lion wherever we went. So at last, we came to the top of the mountain I'd never seen before. And on top of this mountain, there was a garden, trees and fruit and everything. In the middle, there was a well. I knew it was a well because you could see the water bubbling up from the bottom of it, but it was a lot bigger than most wells, like a very big round bath with marble steps going down into it. The water was as clear as anything I thought I could get there and bathe in. It would maybe ease my leg, but the lion told me I must undress first. Mind you, I don't know if he said it in words out loud or not. I was just going to say that I couldn't undress because I hadn't any clothes on when I suddenly thought that dragons are sneaky sorts of things and snakes can cast off their skins. Of course, I thought, I don't know what the lion means. So I started scratching myself and my scales began coming off all over the place. And then I scratched a little deeper, and instead of scales coming off, and there was my skin. I started peeling off beautifully, but like it does after an illness, as if I were a banana. In a minute or two, I just stepped out of it. I could see it lying there beneath me, looking rather nasty. It was a most lovely feeling. So I started to go down into the well for my bath. But just as I was going to put my feet into the water, I looked down and I saw that there was a hand, and rough and wrinkled and scaly as it had been before. Oh, that's all right, I said. It only means I had another smaller suit on underneath the first one. I'll have to get out of that one. So I scratched and tore again, and thus endured underskin, peeled off beautifully, and out I stepped and left it lying behind the other one and went down into the well for my bath. Well, exactly the same thing happened again. And I thought to myself, oh dear, how many of these skins have I got to take off? For I was longing to bathe my legs. So I scratched away for a third time and got off a third skin, just like the two others, and stepped out of it. But soon as I looked at myself in the water, I knew it had been no good. Then the lion said, but I don't know if he said it, if he spoke, you still have to let me undress you. I was afraid of his claws, I can tell you, but I was pretty nearly desperate now. So I just lay flat down on my back and let him do it. The very first tear he made was so deep that I thought he had gone right into my heart. And when he began pulling the skin off, it hurt worse than anything I've ever felt. The only thing that made me able to bear it was just the pleasure of the feeling of the stuff peeling off. You know, if you've never pricked a scab in the same place, it hurts like bully-o, but oh, it's such fun to see it coming away. I know exactly what you mean, said Edmund. Well, he peeled the beastly stuff right off, just as I thought I'd done myself the other 3 times, only they hadn't been. And there it was, lying on the grass, only ever so much thicker and darker and more knobby looking than the others had been. And there was I, with smooth, soft, peeled skin, switch and smaller than I had been. And then he caught hold of me. I didn't like that much, for I was very tender underneath now that I'd no skin on, and threw me into the water. It smarted like anything, but only for a moment. After that, It became perfectly delicious. And as soon as I started swimming and splashing, I found that all the pain had gone from my arm. And then I saw why. I'd turned into a boy again. You'd think me simply phony if I told you how I felt about my own arms. I know they've no muscle, and they're pretty weak and moldy compared to the captain's, but I was so glad to see them. And after a bit, the lion took me out and dressed me. Dressed you? With his paws? Well, I don't exactly remember that bit, but he did somehow or another in new clothes, the same ones I've got on now, as a matter of fact. And then suddenly I was back here, which is what makes me think it must have been a dream. No, it wasn't a dream, said Edmund. Why not? Well, there are the clothes for one thing, and you have been, well, undragoned for another. What do you think it was then? Asked Eustace. I think you have seen Aslan, said Edmund. Aslan, said Edmund. I've heard that name mentioned several times since we joined the Dawn Treader, and I felt, I don't know what, I hated it. But I was hating everything then. And by the way, I'd like to apologize. I'm afraid I've been pretty harsh and pretty beastly. That's all right, said Edmund. Between ourselves, you haven't been as bad as I was on our first trip to Narnia. You were only an ass, but I was a traitor. Well, don't tell me about it then, said Eustace. But who is Aslan? Do you know him? Well, he knows me, said Edmund. He is a great lion, the son of the emperor beyond the sea, who saved me and saved Narnia. We've all seen him. Lucy sees him most often. And it may be Aslan's country we're sailing to. Neither said anything for a while. At last, that bright star vanished, and though they couldn't yet see the sunrise because of the mountains on the right, they knew it was going on because the sky above them and the bay before them turned the color of roses. Then some bird of the parrot kind screamed in the wood behind them, and they heard movements among the trees, and finally the blast of Caspian's horn. The camp was astir. Great was the rejoicing when Edmund was restored, and the restored Eustace walked to the breakfast circle around the campfire. And now, of course, everyone heard the earlier part of the story. People wondered whether the other dragon had killed the Lord Oscarion several years ago, or whether Oscarion himself had been an old dragon. The jewels with which Eustace had crammed his pockets in the cave had disappeared along with his clothes, and he had been wearing, but no one knew, least of all Eustace himself, felt any desire to go back to that valley for more treasure. In a few days now, the Dawn Treader, remasted, repainted, and well-stored, was ready to go on sail again. Before they embarked, Caspian caused to be cut on the smooth cliff facing in the bay the words, Dragon Island, discovered by Caspian X, King of Narnia, etc., in the 4th year of his reign, home, and as we suppose, the Lord Octavian had his death. It would be nice and fairly true to say that from that time forth, Eustace was a different boy. To be strictly accurate, he began to be a different boy. He had relapses. Can you see the sign? There were still many days when he could be very tiresome, but most of those I shall not notice. The case had begun. The cure had begun. Then the Lord Octavian's armoring had a curious fate. Eustace did not want it and offered it to Caspian, and Caspian offered it to Lucy. She did not care about having it. Very well, then, catch as catch can. And Caspian flung it up in the air. This was where they were all standing, looking at the inscription. Up went the ring, flash on the sunlight, and caught and hung as nearly as well thrown as a well-thrown quoit on a little projection in the rock. No one could climb up to get it from below, and no one could climb down from above. And there, for all I know, it is still hanging and may hang till the world ends. And that's the end of chapter 7.